we're now going to have a product review of the Veda airbrush, the WD-130E model. Now this product review is a golden question that is asked me many times about where can I get a cheap airbrush from, which, to be totally honest with you, I would always say, you know, you really need to go off and buy yourself a Harder and Sternbeck and a Watty top of the range kind of airbrush, costing about £100 or something like that, which, although was expensive, these brushes are a lifetime investment. They will last decades and decades. They spray beautifully. You can't really go wrong if you're going to spend about £100 or more. However, I mean, people don't really want to spend that kind of money when they first get started, and they just want to start doing some basic spraying. However, the other option really was going off and buying those cheap Chinese airbrushes, which sadly I wouldn't recommend, because although they're so nice and cheap, the problem is they break down quite quickly, they block up quite quickly, and for a beginner coming into airbrushing, the last thing you want is to be sorting out blockages, the airbrush breaking down. It is such a big off-put if you're trying to spray but your airbrush is literally fighting you all the way. So this is where I went off and I did a load of searching and research, and I found a cheap airbrush that actually is good enough to do the job. It's not as good as all your, you know, Harder and Sternbecks or Watty kind of models, but you know, it's good enough to get you basically spraying for a very cheap price. And this is it, it's the Veda, and that's what you got to look out for, is Veda, right? The cheap Chinese kind of airbrushes you will find don't really have a name, but this one does, and it's called Veda, so that's what you need to look out for. It comes in a very nice chrome finish. It is a dual action. We do have an adjustment screw just here, so we can play around with our trigger. We'll talk about that a bit more. We do have a spanner in there, which we will need that for the for our needle end, and we've also got a pipette, which yeah, bit of a gimmick maybe, and then for our quick release valve, we've got this nice little part to that which comes with it, so we can just quickly slap in a quick release valve, good to go, and you haven't got to buy that, and we get air and we can clip that down and it comes off all nice. So a bit more about this airbrush. Well, as I say, it's a dual action, so it's down for air and back for paint. It's not a single action. A single action is where you press down for air and you get paint at the same time. You do have instructions, I forgot to mention. You've got English one side, Chinese the other, and that's just a nice way of kind of indicating all the different parts. So we do have a what was it called again, the needle adjustment screw at this end. So let's bring you in so you can actually see this. Right, so basically, if you the more you screw this in, I'm pushing with my finger now, pushing back for paint, right, and the more I screw this in, right, the more it forces that trigger forward. So basically now I can't pull that trigger back for any more paint than that is, because this adjustment screw has locked in a memory, so you don't blast out too much paint than you want, and you can really go all the way to the end where this literally doesn't even go back, and we can push that all the way back, so then we can actually kind of have as much paint as we like coming out. So it's a nice little feature which is pretty damn good, I think, for a standard model. You've got a nice colour cup lid as well, which is quite nice, because I mean some of our top branded models don't even come with them, i.e. the Evolution. So what we want to do now is, before we take this apart and have a look inside and have a bit of a talk about the quality of it, let's kind of try some spraying, because this is where it gets kind of surprising. So let's get our quick release valve bit on the bottom there to get some air in. Going to be using Vallejo paints here, so let's get some Vallejo thinners in. Let's get a bit of a kitchen paper towel down. Bit of black Vallejo paint, 057, we'll get some of that in there, about a 50-50 mix, and we'll give it a stir. There we go. We'll check how we're flowing. Right then, so taking a bit of a crash dummy, bit of F14 here, what we're going to do is try some pre-shading just to kind of see, you know, the fineness of this. Let's see. So we're just going to follow some panel lines and see how we can spray. And hopefully, as you can see, that is coming out rather nice. Yeah. So I have noticed that with this particular airbrush, it is, well, I mean with most airbrushes really, you want to kind of take off the guard. I know it's kind of not safe and you end up damaging your needles, but you kind of need to take these off just so you can keep cleaning the actual needle end of any build-up drying paint. But apart from that, you can get quite nice and fine, or shall we say fine enough for modelling. So I do find that when it comes to modelling spraying, you don't need to be as fine as, say, other types of spray work, like, you know, when people spray helmets and cars and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to modelling, you don't need to be mega fine. You can get away with it, and this airbrush really does give you a fine enough line. Right. So there's our nice kind of fine line. I mean, it's not, I'm finding it's not as good as, like, say, an Evolution and Infinity, those top branded kind of airbrushes, but I do find it comes out and feels smooth enough and good enough to do the job. Right? Not the best, but it is good enough, and that is the beauty of this airbrush. So hopefully, as you can see, that is spraying rather nice. So I'm just going to quickly clean this up for the next bit. We're now going to have a look up Veda's skirt to see what she's got hiding and see, you know, what kind of quality we have here. So first off, let's start taking this apart. We're taking off our nozzle end here, and what we've got in here, right, is what is looking very similar to that of a Watty airbrush. Right, as you can see there, we've got that really kind of fine nozzle going on, and guess what, we have to come in with a spanner, and then we simply unscrew that very nicely, very gently, very carefully, and then we can just get that real fine nozzle off there. And as you've probably seen, I don't know how well you can see that, but we have a very, very small, fine little O-ring right on the end there, which on a quality sense, I don't know how long that is going to last. And I do think you really need to be careful when screwing this little nozzle on the end back on, because if you do it too tight, I can just imagine how you're just going to rip the threads up, and then that's it, that's ruined. You've also got another little O-ring as well just here. Don't know if you can see that, and that's quite thin and flimsy, and I can just imagine that being you know, something that could wear away quite quickly as well. So things like maybe cellulose thinners and that could probably wear down these O-rings quite quickly. But it does look like it's going to take a bit of time before they wear out, which by then I think as a basic airbrusher you've probably learnt enough and probably got into the hobby enough to probably go, do you know what, I think I'll go buy myself a Harder and Sternbeck or an Awati or something like that. And then, so let's move along. Let's take off our back here. Let's get you out a little bit. Taking off our back here, you know, just the same as pretty much any airbrush. We unscrew holder screw thingy there, forgot what it was called. What was it again? A needle chucking nut, that was it. Then we take out our needle, which looks like pretty much anybody else. Now feeling the needle as well, I mean we've got a bit of paint on here, let's try and get rid of that as well, because the thing is, I mean, this is where we kind of start to see the difference between the really cheap Chinese airbrushes that aren't named to this Veda airbrush, and that is when you kind of feel the end of the needle here, you'll find that the really cheap ones feel a bit rough, right? Because as they go through kind of like the manufacturing stage, they haven't kind of, you know, got the point as good quality. But this here, you can feel it. It feels just as smooth as any of the top branded airbrush needles out there, and that's quite important because it can affect your spray of how it atomizes, and it can be a bit blobby if it's a bit of a rough needle. But that is really nice, so that's a good point there. What we got here, I mean, the whole kind of inside here, if we just take this out, this kind of needs, I do think, a little bit of oil, right? You don't really need it that necessarily with hold on, there we go. We don't really need that necessarily with the top branded airbrushes, but you can tell they've actually put a bit of oil on our little trigger here. So this is something you might want to think about doing, is just making sure that you maybe put a little bit of oil just in here, just to keep these parts moving nicely. The downside, right, is getting this back in, because I mean this is a little bit of a pain compared to some of our top branded airbrushes. Right, the problem is coming in and putting this back in, which you kind of do need to get out some tweezers, so it's a little bit of a downside. Ooh. So this is going to be a bit tricky, so try and bear with me. So as you can see, it is rather tricky because it's just this little middle piece in here. So let's use gravity to kind of let it sit on our trigger, and then come in from the top with the rest of our pieces in our spring, and then that should then butt up between the trigger and our little centerpiece there, which they call it a lever guide. And that should be all good now, so we should be able to, as an indication that you've put it back together right, is that this trigger should go down and go back quite nicely, which it does. So apart from that little bit of a tricky kind of placing that bit in there, excuse me, which I think you'll probably get the hang of it as you take this apart now and then. So what we want to do is we want to put back in the nozzle. I want to just do it finger tight, right? And then what I like to do, I don't think you really need to go that mental with it, just a little bit, and I mean just a little bit of a turn. Right, I did literally a quarter turn there, so it just feels a bit on the tight side. Don't want to go nuts, right? I mean, if it starts kind of bubbling up through the top here, maybe you might want to tighten it up a bit more, but it's better to kind of adjust it later than to actually kind of cross thread them. Needle in from the back, nice and slowly until it you just get that bit of resistance in the needle end, the nozzle end, and then we can lock this back in with our needle chucking nut. Alright, then we can test it, pulling back, seeing that the needle is coming in and out of the nozzle. Alright, and we can just put the rest of it nice and simply back together. So there you go. I mean, the other thing is as well is the actual chrome paintwork that has gone on here. If you do look kind of in places, you might be able to see, I mean, here's an example. You can actually see the brass in places haven't been sprayed. As you can see there, we've got chrome and then we've got a bit of brass there on the threads. Kind of says that maybe the spray job isn't as good as probably our top branded airbrushes. So you know, how long it lasts, I don't know, but I think this is the whole point and kind of like the conclusion of this airbrush. So I plain and simply think that this airbrush really is an airbrush to get a beginner modeler into airbrushing nice and cheaply, nice and easily. It's good enough to last you. I don't know how long it's going to last. I don't think it's a lifetime airbrush. I do think it will eventually break down, the paintwork will kind of fade and everything, but I think it's going to last you long enough to know whether or not you want to kind of, you know, go ahead full on with this hobby or not. And it's cheap enough to just get you started, so that, you know, if you don't like the hobby, you've only lost a certain amount of money. And this is part of the video where I get to say how much this is, because it's an airbrush that's good enough, but how much is it? And simply, this is £15, which it really does sell this airbrush off as an absolute excellent airbrush. I don't think you can beat the price of £15 for an airbrush that is good enough to do the job. Both, I mean, really, this is definitely good for basic beginners, people to get them started, but even for intermediate professional modelers, it's a nice cheap second airbrush, or a third airbrush, or a fourth airbrush, you know, for doing different colours, maybe having a particular airbrush for just gloss work, or a particular airbrush for lacquer based paints. You know, it really is just so cheap, it makes it such an excellent airbrush.